Hello and welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Sean Lay. Malaysia has had its first change of government in 60 years. It took a huge corruption scandal to topple the previous one, yet the same two names dominate the country's political debate, which have done for the last 20 years. Mahathir, a retired Prime Minister who returned to power at the age of 92, and Anwar, the man who was jailed, then pardoned, and is now Mahathir's chosen successor. Syed Saddiq is the youngest cabinet minister in Asia, in a country where the average age is in the mid-20s. He says Malaysia is a country of reform and modernisation. No country for old men? Or is Malaysia still trapped by the attitude shaped in its colonial past? Syed Saddiq, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you very much. Sean.
Last year's general election resulted in the first change of government since independence back in the mid-1950s. I mean, it's a hugely significant moment in Malaysia's history. How important do you think that election will be for the country's future?
To me, the fact that this is the first change in government for Malaysia will allow for the youth to shape the future of Malaysia for the next 20 to 30 years. We've never had a change in government, and now we do. And I believe what we do in the next term will determine what is to come for the next 20 years. I'm very hopeful and optimistic, especially when we have more and more young people shaping the future of our beloved Malaysia.
You've given them an opportunity to do that by lowering the voting age from 21 to 18.
It will be tabled in Parliament, most likely in March.
And this is something that all the parties of the governing coalition support, so it should become law.
We need a two-third majority and a constitutional amendment. But as soon as we discussed this in Cabinet, I brought this up, and there's a consensus on that. I've been engaging with all opposition parties, UMNO, PBB, and all the opposition parties, and there seems to be a consensus on this issue. So hopefully, we will get a unanimous decision through Parliament to reduce the voting age to 18 years old.
So from 21 to 18, what will that mean in terms of the numbers it will add to the electoral roll?
To me, that means truly cementing youth power for the next few decades. Reason being is, in the last election, there were about 41% of youth voters who determined the outcome of the election. If we reduce voting age to 18 years old, that means there will be an additional of about 5 million new voters. From 18 to 21 now, they're about 2.6. But let's not forget, election will come in about 2022. That means those who are 15 today will be allowed to vote, which means that about 50% of those on the electoral roll will come from young people of Malaysia. That means any party, whether it's my party or the opposition, cannot mess with the youth of Malaysia. So
they can vote, but many of them at the moment can't find a job.
That is an issue. That's why the first thing which I want to do is...
Big issue, was it 10.8%?
I think it's about 10.7.
Okay.
And the plan of the government is to reduce the rate of unemployment, youth unemployment, to single digit. It's still significantly lower than the global average, it's about 18%. But we cannot fall behind Thailand, Singapore, which is about 4%.
I was going to say, in the region, it's higher, isn't it? I mean, exactly. Singapore 4.5%, Thailand about 6%, Vietnam 7%. Yeah. I mean, you know the statistics better than I do. China is the country that has the same level of youth unemployment. But it's not so much the numbers, which is a story for every single one of those young people who wants a job and can't find one. It's about how that matches the economy and the ambitions you have.
Exactly.
204,000 graduates without a job at the last statistics your government released. 40.5% of Malaysia's unemployed, and yet only 4% of vacancies are for graduates or professionals. That's quite a mismatch.
But I believe in the next few years, we will resolve the structural issues. One is we need to start looking into the gig economy. We need to start looking into the fourth industrial revolution, where jobs will slowly be replaced with automation. But I believe the future lies in vocational education. Under my ministry, there are 22 vocational institutions, and the rate of employment for the graduates is at 94%, much higher than graduates of universities.
So Malaysia's universities, are they poor quality, or are they just teaching the wrong subjects?
So I believe as long as we update the subjects, try our best to shorten the time to ensure that the subjects which we teach continuously get updated.
So some of them are out of date?
Yes. So the good thing is the Ministry of Education and Dr. Mazli is looking to phase out unnecessary subjects and to always update the curriculum.
Can you give me some examples of what you mean by unnecessary subjects, or things that no longer serve the purpose of the economy?
Exactly. So each university will have their compulsory subjects. So there are different universities have different subjects, whether it's up to history or religious education. The point is to ensure that we are industry-driven and industry-led. While we should not forget about humanities, there must be a balance.
The NIDF research, which analyses the economy for manufacturers, wrote at the time the last unemployment figures came out, we view the rising youth unemployment rate is possibly due to skills mismatch. For example, out of all vacancies, 76% were for elementary occupations. The next biggest category was 10%, and that's for plant and machinery operators and assemblers, which are semi-skilled. So, I mean, there is a huge problem here. And I accept what you're saying about change and evolution and all the rest of it, but it doesn't help somebody in their early to mid-20s who has trained and tried to become qualified and then is told by their own country, sorry, we don't yet have work for you of your school basis. They're just going to go abroad, aren't they?
And this is where it's critical for us to update the curriculum and also pivot
But it doesn't help those people who've already graduated.
But we need to look into vocational education, reskilling and upskilling, where the government subsidizes a significant amount and puts through our young graduates through a skill-based internship process, so that even though they might start out with a phased-out jobs, but in the end they can be reskilled further, government invests in them, pairs them up with the industry players, and in the end they get better jobs.
Are they going to hang around for that, or are they just going to go abroad?
I have a strong feeling that if you're able to invest enough, they will stay in Malaysia. There's new hope and great optimism. We do plan to bring those who are brought back and keep those who are in the country. No more brain drain.
Malaysia is a young country. The average age is about 28. You're just slightly younger at 26. Yet you're a minister in a cabinet which is led by the oldest head of government in the world.
I always joke around that one of the reasons I brought in is to average the age of the cabinet, a 93-year-old and a 25-year-old. But I think this shows a new future for Malaysia. It's not just about me. I'm young. There's also Yobi, and the Minister of Environment, who's 35 years old. There are, I think, about 2 or 3 deputy ministers who are below 40 years old. The point is, youth representation in cabinet has increased, and not about youth representation
alone. But you're
alone.
still a minority, but you're a long way behind. I'm sure they listen to you, and they should listen to you with respect. But in the end, your views are going to count far less than all those men and women in their 50s and 60s and 70s and 90s, aren't they?
I disagree. The unique part is, when I'm 25, 26, there's a great form of idealism. At the same time, I speak my mind, and the cabinet allows me to speak my mind on these issues, and they listen. And that's where we see, for an example, from reducing voting age to 18 years old, to reducing the definition of youth from 40 to 30, which was just passed in cabinet recently, on education reforms where the youth ministry is taken into account, and many, many landmark changes which have taken place, factored in the voices of the youth ministry.
And in terms of what this will mean in the government you serve, I suppose it's, I mean, you said, I think late last year, you were quoted as saying of Mahathir, he's meticulous, he's hardworking, he's tireless. I got tired following him during the campaign. He was receptive to new ideas like using social media or live streaming his speeches. I mean, I think some people watching or listening to this interview might think, it's hard to imagine that he knows much about Instagram and Facebook when he grew up in the generation that had to rely on shortwave radio and the telegraph.
But, I mean, he is always adaptive to changes. I remember during times of election, when we didn't have control over the media, it's monopolized by the government, we didn't have a lot of resources like the ruling government then, we had to think of unconventional methods to reach out to the community. And that's where he really used Facebook Live. Every week we had policy talks which reaches out to hundreds and thousands of people. And during the final day of election, his Facebook Live, there was more than 270,000 live viewers, a record high in ASEAN. We do find unique ways to reach out and to send a message to the Malaysian populace.
For a man who's still in touch in the way you describe and is still engaged and you say is willing to listen to young people and take on board your concerns and adapt policy accordingly, I mean, it doesn't sound like a man who's ready for retirement.
I mean, he has mentioned and signalled many, many times, even though there were some portions of the community who says, please stay on, please stay on. But he has said times after times again, the most recent one, in our party General Assembly, you would expect that's a time when you're going to go, I will stay on as long as possible. He said that he will step down before the next election.
Which is in 2022?
Yeah. But his
so
focus,
the suggestion that he will go next year, there's no guarantee of that?
No, I was one of the persons who signed the agreement between all coalition partners. I'm the member of the Presidential Council in Pakatan Harapan. There is no agreement that it should be 2 years.
Right.
The one
That's
who mentioned
very interesting because it has been said quite a lot by people in public.
Yes, because the one who said it is actually Tun Dr. Mahathir. If you look at the other people who are a part of the Presidential Council, none of them said that it's 2 years.
So Dr. Mahathir has said 2 years, but nobody is going to hold him to it. If next year he says, actually, I'm quite enjoying this, it's quite refreshing. I was Prime Minister more than 20 years ago. I'm back. Now I'm back. I don't feel like retiring.
Knowing him, he is very focused.
Could go on and on and on.
But knowing him, he's very focused on reforming the country. He has nothing else to lose. He already has a legacy. He brought dysfunctional opposition to win a landmark election, he has nothing else to lose. He just wants to ensure that Malaysia's name will be in the eyes of the world once again.
Well, it's certainly that. I mean, you do understand that some people will say, well, that's a case of, to use the expression, old wine in new bottles. That he reinvented himself, but he's the same old politician from 20, 30 years ago, some of whose methods were very heavily internationally criticised, not least what he did to the man who he now says will be his successor, Anwar, who 20 years ago he was dismissed from the cabinet over allegations of homosexuality.
Judge him on his policies today. He has freed up the media. I mean, during 8:30 Prime News, back then, they'll never criticize the government, and now almost every day.
No, but he was the government. It doesn't matter when the media criticise him, it's about how he behaves.
Today, it has changed significantly. The media is free to report. At the same time, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission reports directly to the Parliament, no longer under his purview. We have decentralised power, put a term limit on the Prime Minister, many institutional reforms which goes beyond the personality of a leader. That is the future of Malaysia.
I take your point, but that's the future you've got to get to at some point. Right now, he is in charge.
And he has led those reforms.
Let's leave aside what he said about when he's dismissed them, when he said, he was quoted as saying, I cannot have a sodomizer in my cabinet. Imagine a gay Prime Minister, nobody would be safe. Anwar sued him for defamation.
Never allow the past to lock us and imprison us from moving forward.
This is a very good argument you're making, and it is the question of whether somebody who has been so prominent, has behaved in particular in the past, can change, and whether they can be a catalyst for change or not. And you can understand, can't you, Anwar may be just a little bit cautious about believing that he will really get power from a man who not only did that to him, whose regime played such a part in his imprisonment and all the rest of it that happened to him, even though he was eventually pardoned by the king, was described by Amnesty International during his time in prison as a prisoner of conscience, a man who was there not for any crime he committed, but because of his being politically inconvenient to the ruling government led by Mahathir. Isn't it hard to imagine Mahathir handing over power to a man who just 5 years ago, he said, wasn't even qualified to be a chief minister of one of the Malay states, never mind the prime minister?
If this coalition is governed based on caution, we would never be able to win the election. The reason why we're able to do so is because these leaders were able to put their differences aside and unite for a common cause and purpose.
Power.
When we are not, it's not for power, to bring down the biggest global kleptocracy. And currently, we have moved forward. I think that's the most important.
Okay, but let me just interrupt you at that point, because you say it wasn't about power. Listen to what Mahathir said about Anwar in February 2014, just under 5 years ago. He formed a party purely to ensure he becomes a prime minister, not to fight for related religion and nation. Everywhere he struggled is it only to become prime minister. And are we to believe that Mahathir has now completely changed his view of Anwar, is now saying, I was wrong about Anwar, he's a really good guy, not for political convenience, because I can trust him to take the reins of power.
And in 2018, we signed an agreement, the members of the Presidential of Pakatan Harapan signed an agreement where
this is the governing coalition.
Exactly. Yeah. So not in 2014, but 2018, that he'll be the Prime Minister, and then will come Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim. And post-election, they've been working very closely with one another, meeting almost weekly. So I believe that
almost
the change
weekly.
will happen.
Very impressive. I mean, some people might meet every couple of days at that level of government. But I will leave that. Perhaps I'm being mischievous. A more serious point is this. Mahathir will be 94 next year. You've just said he may go on until he's 95. You've given him that flexibility. Anwar will be 72, 73. You and your colleagues have given me that flexibility. In a country where the median age is half a century lower even than Anwar's age, why not just skip a generation? Let the young people, and I'm not necessarily saying you, I'm not going to embarrass you by that, but maybe let somebody who is merely 40 take charge.
I think what matters is the demand and the will of the people. And when we entered into that coalition, a difficult coalition, but we were able to put aside our differences, it is an agreement which was made by all of us. I believe whether it's Tun Dr. Mahathir or Datuk Sri Anwar, the youth leadership of the coalition will always be respected and their voices heard. As I mentioned before, my goal in this new Malaysia is not to govern for the next 50 or 100 years. We will be voted out at one point in time. But what matters is institutional reforms. What matters is empowering the youth so that even when there is a change in government, the voices of young people
and all communities
will always be there. Exactly. So
all communities across the board need to have an equal voice.
Of course. So I think in the end, once we do that,
so why have you joined a party which only permits people who come from indigenous communities to stand for election?
Because I believe what's most important is that the coalition which governs all Malaysians are inherently multiracial. But
but
under
your
that
party
coalition,
isn't. the parties aren't. I mean, surely that's a really concrete example. This is a country that had race riots at the end of the 1960s. It introduced affirmative action policies. If it still has political parties that are based on race, then doesn't, and actually not just that they are traditionally based on race, but actually prevents you from being a candidate if you come from, I don't know, the 24% of the population is Chinese, or the 7% is Indian, or the other non-indigenous communities. That's the kind of thing that will prove what you mean, not the warm words, and they are very warm and very, I'm sure, very sincerely held words, but they don't matter a jot unless you change the things that determine people's opportunities.
Let's look at Malaysian history. In 1957, when we seek for independence, the indigenous community only held about 2 to 3% of the total economic equity of the nation. 90% of Malaysians who earn below 100 ringgit, which is about 20
when the
pounds.
British were in charge.
20 pounds, right? 90% of them came from the Bumiputra indigenous community. On top of that, those who started businesses there, out of 8,000 businesses in the 1970s, only 9% were held by the indigenous community.
And now we're in 2019. Why are you, you're telling me don't be imprisoned by the past? Why is your party still imprisoned by the past?
So the point is to ensure that while we expand Malaysia's economic pie, we pursue for policy of equitable economic redistribution, to say that Malaysia is a country which no longer considers race and religious lines is wrong. The point is, socio-economic inequities also factor into account racial and religious inequities. We want to ensure that all races and religions will get their fair share of the economic pie.
And what about other minority communities? I mean, you took some affirmative action of your own because you had a prominent campaigner for gay rights, Newman Afifi, as an aide during the campaign, but he never made it into government. Why not?
So my suggestion, if you want to ask about Noman, you can ask him himself.
Can I ask you? You're in the studio, he's not.
Sure. He made the decision to leave the team when the time came. He was instrumental.
Who determined when the time came?
It was him.
Okay.
I gave him the option.
You gave him the option of coming into the ministry?
Of course.
You offered him a job?
Yes.
If he'd accepted, you would have had him in the ministry?
Of course.
Even if somebody above you had said, we don't like this guy, we don't like gay rights campaigners in our government.
Let's be fair. In my ministry, there are about 2,000 employees. If I have a policy of assessing each and every one of their sexuality, it becomes almost impossible for me to do so. The point is the work which you put in and the merit which you have. I think that's what matters the most when we move forward.
Charles Santiago, who is an MP who supports your government, the Alliance of Hope, as it translates, Pakatan Harapan, he said that Newman Afifi was the victim of regressive treatment.
My suggestion, if you really think that he's a victim of regressive treatment, I've actually written his phone number here. You can call him now or after and ask what his decision was.
Because we might lose time, but I'm sure we can. I'm sure we can ask him.
What matters the most? What matters the most?
Charles Santiago's comments
is to allow this particular individuals to decide themselves. Was he the victim of
regressive treatment?
This part I disagree.
Okay.
I think what matters the most in this new Malaysia is that everyone should be given the right to voice out their opinions.
And your government made promises on a part of this concept of a new Malaysia of equality. We'll leave aside the question of women in cabinet, which was supposed to be 30%. It's only 18% at the moment, but it's less than a year in, so let's see if it changes.
Even let's be fair. You're starting on women empowerment. It's something which we
women
feel,
in cabinet, because that was the pledge.
We care a lot about that, and we're working in that direction. There are two key changes in Malaysia. One is you look at women on corporate boards.
Yes.
From those about 12%, now we have reached more than 20%.
Your coalition made a pledge to this, and you hope to
and we will, and we'll try our best to reach.
Okay.
Our Deputy Prime Minister, for the first time in Malaysian history, is a woman.
It's a woman.
So we've made progress, even though there are some imperfections. We will strive in that direction.
Good. Let's in our last few minutes take another example. The law of sedition. During the election, the Alliance promised its repeal. Yet when King Mohammed, who is going to be succeeded shortly after we record this interview, his successor will be chosen, announced his resignation as head of state, 3 people who criticised him were arrested for sedition.
Malaysia is a constitutional monarchy. A part of our identity is linked to the kings, which we respect dearly. At the same time, we want to ensure that the Sedition Act is still repealed while there are sufficient enactments to protect the interests of the rulers. So I think that's what we are looking at the moment.
So when Minister said last year the law is suspended pending abolition, there's been a change of heart about that because you've decided there aren't enough alternative mechanisms where you can prosecute what you regard as unacceptable behaviour.
So currently we're trying to find a way in which one thing is clear is we will fulfill a part of our manifesto, which is to repeal the Sedition Act.
So you might just give it a new name and bring it back under a different name?
No, of course not. Because we want to the problem with the Sedition Act is that it doesn't look into the value of intention, and therefore someone who says something despite not intending to do so can still be imprisoned capriciously. The new law will still protect the interests of the kings, while at the same time will never again allow for political dissidents to be jailed for arbitrary reason. We want to ensure that it's airtight so that abuses no longer happen.
As Minister for Sport, you're promoting Malaysia's hosting of the World Para Swimming Championships. Why are you denying your disabled swimmers the opportunity to prove themselves against some of the world's best swimmers?
I think what matters is the Malaysian government's stance on this issue. If hosting an international event is more important than safeguarding the interests of our Palestinian brothers and sisters who have been mutilated times after times again. If that is more important, that means we have lost our moral conscience and moral compass.
So all the other countries who permit Israel to participate in international sporting events have lost their moral conscience?
Malaysia is not like other countries.
So you're superior to the UK, the US, Australia, all those other countries, the African countries, the Asian countries.
When countries criticize Israel and censure them in the United Nations, one is US will veto it more than 47 times. On top of that, when we censure Israel, US and the Western world would actually punish these small countries for having a stance. I mean, Donald Trump cut $200 million worth of development aid, which could save 5 million Palestinians just because the international community did not stand with it.
Some passion,
we must be fair.
And I'm sure that's sincere. But I wonder if you then share Prime Minister Mahathir's view of Jews. He said, I'm glad to be labelled anti-Semitic. He said this in May last year. How can I be, or he was quoted in May last year, how can I be otherwise when the Jews who so often talk of horrors they suffered during the Holocaust show the same Nazi cruelty?
My stance is I'm against the atrocities committed, especially by the Netanyahu government. It is the actions which I stand firmly against, not the race of that person, but their actions. During Atlet, Protective Age, Pillars of Defense, tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians had their lives murdered, families taken away,
and plenty of countries
sanctions
condemn that and take action against it.
So Malaysia must stand firm.
They don't stand against the opportunity for people of all communities, countries to come together. It is not members of the Israeli government who are committing the Paralympic team as swimmers. It's young men and women, the future generations.
It's also young men.
For Israelis and Malaysians to meet each other on common terms in sporting competitions, talk to each other and share their concern.
The state is the locus of our collective moral actions. While it's not the fault of all Israelis, similarly in the context of Palestine, it's not the fault of all Palestinians for the aggression of some.
I just wonder what, though, and this goes back to what we talked about at the very start of this programme, Saddiq, and that is whether we have a country that is still determined by attitudes of the past. Your Prime Minister, in a book he published back in 1970, The Malay Dilemma, said the Jews are not merely hook-nosed, as if that was some kind of source of criticism, but understand money instinctively. High-minded condemnation of the human rights of a government is one thing, but when you fall back on stereotypes of physical appearance, he used it again in this studio when he was interviewed for Hard Talk recently, and instinct, are you in the gutter of politics?
I hope you understand where he is coming from. To me, what matters the most
are the atrocities you're going to as a country.
So where I believe we are going is a country which will speak up against the gruesome human rights violations, the actions and the propensity for violence. These are the things which we will oppose and we will never stand for. I think in the end what matters are the aggression and a government like Malaysia having the guts to speak up despite the fact that there might be consequences.
Is that the new progressive Malaysia you want to promote?
It is progressive. We stand for the rule of law. We are against human rights violations. We are against war crimes and crimes of aggression. That is the new Malaysia.
Syed Saddiq, Minister for Youth and Sport in Malaysia's government. Thank you very much for being with us on
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.